The morning mist clung to the dark waters of Ironbottom Sound as Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner's amphibious fleet approached the Solomon Islands. On August 7, 1942, through the pre-dawn gloom, the silhouettes of Henderson Field's half-constructed airstrip emerged like a sleeping giant. What the Japanese defenders didn't know was that their peaceful morning was about to become the opening salvo of America's first major offensive in the Pacific War. Major General Alexander Archer Vandegrift stood on the bridge of the USS Macaulay, watching his 1st Marine Division prepare for what would become the bloodiest campaign in Marine Corps' history. The plan was audacious in its simplicity: seize the airfield before the Japanese could complete it, then hold it at all costs. What seemed like a straightforward amphibious assault would evolve into a 6-month nightmare that would test the resolve of both nations. The Japanese garrison on Guadalcanal numbered barely 2,400 men, mostly construction workers and engineers building what they called Airfield No. 1. They were under the command of Captain Kenny Monson, who had been assured by Tokyo that the island was too remote and strategically insignificant to warrant American attention. This miscalculation would prove catastrophic for the Japanese war effort. As the first wave of Marines hit Red Beach at 0900 hours, they encountered minimal resistance. The Japanese defenders, caught completely off guard, fled into the jungle, abandoning their equipment and half-eaten breakfast. Private First Class Robert Leckie of the 1st Marines later wrote about the surreal quiet that followed the landing, describing how the Marines expected fierce resistance but found only empty bunkers and scattered rice bowls. The ease of the initial landing masked the true challenge ahead. While the Marines secured the airfield within 36 hours, renaming it Henderson Field after Major Lofton Henderson, who had died at Midway, the Japanese High Command was already planning their response. Emperor Hirohito himself declared that Guadalcanal must be retaken at any cost, marking the first time in the war that Japan would commit to a prolonged ground campaign against American forces. According to declassified documents from the National Archives, the Japanese Navy's reaction was swift and decisive. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, immediately began redirecting resources from other Pacific operations to what the Japanese would call the Starvation Island. The stage was set for a campaign that would consume ships, planes, and men from both sides in unprecedented numbers. Within 72 hours of the landing, the character of the battle began to change. Japanese destroyers and cruisers started their nightly runs down the slot, the channel between the Solomon Islands, bringing reinforcements and supplies while bombarding Marine positions. These runs became known as the Tokyo Express, and they transformed Guadalcanal from a quick strike operation into a grinding war of attrition. The Marines quickly discovered that taking the airfield was only the beginning. The island's dense jungle, oppressive heat, and tropical diseases created a hostile environment that claimed as many casualties as enemy action. Malaria, dysentery, and dengue fever ravaged both sides, while the constant threat of Japanese counterattacks kept every Marine on edge. As the first week ended, it became clear that Guadalcanal would not be another quick American victory. The Japanese were regrouping, and intelligence reports indicated massive reinforcements heading south. The real battle for Guadalcanal was about to begin. The sound of naval gunfire echoed across Henderson Field as Marines huddled in their foxholes. During the early morning hours of August 19, 1942, the Japanese had discovered that daylight belonged to American air power, but darkness was their domain. Under cover of night, fast destroyers and cruisers raced down the Solomon Islands chain, delivering troops and supplies while subjecting the Marines to devastating bombardments. Captain Joseph Foss, who would later become America's top Marine ace, described the nightly ritual of the Tokyo Express as psychological warfare at its finest. The Japanese timing was precise: arrive after midnight, bombard Marine positions, unload reinforcements, and disappear before dawn brought American dive bombers. This cat-and-mouse game would define the rhythm of the Guadalcanal campaign. The man orchestrating this nocturnal ballet was Rear Admiral Reizo Tanaka, a brilliant tactician who understood that conventional naval warfare had little place in the confined waters of the Solomons. His fast cruisers and destroyers had become the lifeline for Japanese forces on Guadalcanal, earning him the nickname Tenacious Tanaka among American naval officers, who grudgingly respected his skill. On the American side, the burden of stopping the Tokyo Express fell largely on the pilots of Marine Air Group 33, flying from Henderson Field's crude coral runway. Major John Lucian Smith led his fighter squadron in desperate attempts to intercept the nightly runs, but the Japanese had perfected their timing. By the time Marine Grumman Wildcats could scramble, the enemy ships were already disappearing into the darkness. The most devastating blow came on the night of August 24th, when Admiral Tanaka's force delivered 1,800 fresh troops of the Ichiki Regiment while simultaneously bombarding Henderson Field. With over 500 shells, the Marines, exhausted from weeks of fighting, watched helplessly as their precious airfield was torn apart by naval gunfire. Fuel dumps exploded, aircraft were destroyed, and the runway itself was cratered beyond immediate use. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson of the 1st Raider Battalion understood the strategic implications better than most. In his after-action report, he wrote that the Tokyo Express represented the enemy's greatest tactical innovation of the Pacific War. The Japanese had solved the fundamental problem of reinforcing isolated garrisons under air attack by embracing the cover of darkness and accepting the risks of night naval operations. The psychological impact on the Marines was enormous. During daylight hours, they controlled the skies and could call in air strikes on Japanese positions. But every night brought the terror of naval bombardment and the knowledge that more enemy troops were being landed. Sleep became a luxury, and the constant strain began to show in the hollow eyes and trembling hands of even veteran Marines. The Americans attempted to counter the Tokyo Express with their own night operations, but early results were disastrous. The Battle of Savo Island on August 9th had already demonstrated American inadequacy in night fighting. When a Japanese cruiser force sank for Allied heavy cruisers in less than an hour, the lesson was clear. The Imperial Navy owned the night, and American forces would have to adapt or face annihilation. Contemporary reports from Time magazine described the nightly bombardments as a hellish carousel of death that left Marine positions looking like the surface of the moon. The Japanese strategy was working. Henderson Field was being gradually reduced to rubble, and Marine morale was reaching a breaking point. Yet the Tokyo Express carried within it the seeds of its own destruction. Each successful run required perfect timing and coordination, and the Japanese were operating at the extreme range of their logistics network. More critically, the constant naval operations were consuming fuel and wearing down ships that Japan could not easily replace. As August drew to a close, both sides prepared for the decisive phase of the campaign. The Japanese had successfully reinforced their garrison to over 6,000 men, while the Marines clung to their perimeter around Henderson Field with grim determination. The Tokyo Express had prolonged the battle, but it had also ensured that Guadalcanal would become a test of national will rather than a quick tactical victory. The steaming jungle fell silent except for the distant sound of Japanese voices calling out coordinates in the pre-dawn darkness of September 13th, 1942. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Austin Edson crouched behind a fallen log on the ridge that would forever bear his name, watching as thousands of enemy soldiers prepared for what they believed would be the final assault on Henderson Field. The Japanese plan was ambitious in its scope and desperate in its execution. Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi had landed with 3,500 troops of the 35th Infantry Brigade, confident that a coordinated night attack would overwhelm the exhausted Marines and recapture the airfield. The ridge south of Henderson Field, barely 700 yards from the runway, represented the key terrain that would determine the fate of the entire campaign. Edson's 1st Raider Battalion and 1st Parachute Battalion held the thin line across the ridge, fewer than 800 Marines facing an enemy force more than 4 times their size. The terrain favored the defenders, steep slopes covered in dense jungle that channeled attacking forces into predictable avenues of approach. But the Marines were exhausted, undersupplied, and suffering from the endemic diseases that plagued both sides. The strategic implications of the Guadalcanal campaign extended far beyond the capture of a single airfield in the Solomon Islands. The Japanese military machine, which had seemed invincible after Pearl Harbor, had been stopped and then driven back by American forces that had learned to fight with the same tenacity and skill as their opponents. The psychological impact on both sides was profound and lasting. For the Japanese, Guadalcanal represented the beginning of the end. The Imperial Navy had lost 24 warships, including 2 battleships, 4 cruisers, and a light carrier. The Imperial Army had sacrificed an entire corps of veteran troops, men who could not be easily replaced. Most critically, Japan had lost the strategic initiative in the Pacific and would spend the remainder of the war responding to American moves rather than dictating the pace of operations. The human cost of the campaign was staggering. American casualties totaled over 7,000 killed and wounded, while Japanese losses exceeded 24,000. The tropical diseases that plagued both sides added thousands more to the casualty rolls, creating a generation of veterans who would carry the physical and psychological scars of Guadalcanal for the rest of their lives. According to the official Army history, the lessons learned on Guadalcanal would shape American strategy for the remainder of the Pacific War. The importance of air power, the vulnerability of extended supply lines, and the effectiveness of night fighting techniques all became standard elements of American military doctrine. The campaign had served as a brutal but effective school for the officers and men who would lead the drive across the Pacific. The individual stories of heroism and sacrifice that emerged from Guadalcanal became part of American military legend. Medal of Honor recipients like Sergeant John Basilone, who held off an entire Japanese regiment with a single machine gun, embodied the spirit of determination that had won the campaign. These men became symbols of American resilience and the price of victory in the Pacific. The Japanese perspective on Guadalcanal was equally significant. The failure of the campaign shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility that had been carefully cultivated since the Russo-Japanese War. Veteran officers who had conquered the Philippines and Dutch East Indies found themselves outfought by American forces that had learned to adapt to Japanese tactics and technology. The strategic balance in the Pacific had shifted irrevocably. The combined fleet, which had dominated the Pacific for 8 months, now faced an American Navy that had learned to fight effectively at night and coordinate complex multi-service operations. The technological advantages that had given Japan early victories were being countered by American industrial capacity and tactical innovation. The airfield that had cost so much blood to capture became the foundation for American advances. Throughout the Solomon Islands, Henderson Field expanded and improved, served as the launching point for campaigns that would carry American forces to Rabaul, the Philippines, and eventually to the shores of Japan itself. The Marines who had held the perimeter through months of bombardment and assault had secured the base for America's Pacific offensive. The Battle of Guadalcanal marked the moment when the Pacific War turned from a series of Japanese victories to an American advance that would culminate in total victory. The campaign had demonstrated that Japanese forces could be defeated through superior tactics, better logistics, and the willingness to accept casualties in pursuit of strategic objectives. As the last American patrols swept through the abandoned Japanese positions, they found evidence of an enemy that had fought with courage and determination, but had ultimately been defeated by an opponent that had learned to match their skill and exceed their endurance. The jungle island that had witnessed such carnage became a symbol of American victory and the beginning of Japan's long retreat across the Pacific. The legacy of Guadalcanal would echo through the remainder of the war, a reminder that victory in the Pacific would require sacrifice, determination, and the willingness to learn from both success and failure. The campaign had transformed both the American military and the nature of warfare in the Pacific, setting the stage for the final drive toward Tokyo. The first Japanese probe came at 2100 hours, a company-sized force that struck the Marine left flank with savage intensity. The sound of rifle fire and grenade explosions echoed across the ridge as small groups of Japanese soldiers infiltrated between Marine positions. In the darkness, friend and foe became indistinguishable. and hand-to-hand combat erupted throughout the defensive line. Corporal Walter Scott of the 1st Parachute Battalion later described the chaos of that first night. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face, but you could hear them coming through the jungle. The sound of a Japanese Type 99 rifle was different from our M1s, and that's about the only way you could tell who was who. The Japanese assault reached its crescendo just after midnight, when 3 battalions simultaneously attacked the center of the Marine line. The ridge erupted in muzzle flashes and explosions as wave after wave of Japanese soldiers charged up the steep slopes, shouting "Banzai" and "Marines you die." The defensive line bent, but did not break, held together by the leadership of Marines like Sergeant Major Jacob Vuza, who continued fighting despite severe wounds. Major General Kawaguchi had underestimated both the terrain and the resolve of his opponents. The jungle that he thought would provide concealment instead became a maze that broke up his formations and prevented coordinated attacks. The Marines, fighting from prepared positions, were able to concentrate their fire on the narrow approaches while calling in artillery support from the 105th Artillery Battalion. The second night brought even heavier attacks as Kawaguchi committed his reserves in a desperate attempt to break through. The Japanese artillery, mortars, and naval gunfire from destroyers offshore pounded the Marine positions, but Edson's men held their ground. The ridge became a killing ground, where individual acts of heroism determined the outcome of squad-level actions that collectively decided the fate of the campaign. According to the official Marine Corps' history, the turning point came when Edson personally led a counterattack against Japanese forces that had penetrated the Marine center. Armed with a Thompson submachine gun and accompanied by a handful of raiders, he charged into the darkness and drove back an enemy force 10 times his size. His actions rallied the entire line and prevented a breakthrough that would have reached Henderson Field. The dawn of September 15th revealed the true cost of the battle. The ridge was littered with Japanese dead, over 600 soldiers who had died in the futile assault. Marine casualties were heavy as well, with over 100 killed or wounded. But the line had held. More importantly, the myth of Japanese invincibility in jungle warfare had been shattered. General Kawaguchi's defeat at Bloody Ridge marked the beginning of the end for Japanese hopes on Guadalcanal. The failure of the ground assault forced the Japanese to rely increasingly on naval bombardment and air attacks, strategies that could harass the Marines but could not dislodge them from their positions. The ridge that had witnessed such carnage became a symbol of Marine determination and tactical superiority. Henderson Field remained in American hands, and the long process of grinding down Japanese resistance on Guadalcanal could begin. The waters around Guadalcanal turned crimson in the pre-dawn light of November 13, 1942. As the most decisive naval battle of the Pacific War reached its climax, Rear Admiral Daniel Judson Callahan lay dying on the bridge of the USS San Francisco, his flagship locked in a point-blank gunfight with Japanese battleships that had come to destroy Henderson Field once and for all. The Japanese plan was breathtaking. In its audacity, Admiral Hiroaki Abe had brought to battleships the Haie and Kirishima, along with a screening force of cruisers and destroyers to conduct what the Japanese called the decisive bombardment. Nearly 1,500 shells of 14-inch and 16-inch ammunition would reduce Henderson Field to rubble, clearing the way for a massive troop convoy scheduled to arrive the following day. Standing in their path was Task Force 67, 5 cruisers and 8 destroyers under Admiral Callaghan's command. The American force was outnumbered and outgunned, but it represented the only barrier between the Japanese battleships and the Marines fighting ashore. The stage was set for a night battle that would determine the fate of the entire Guadalcanal campaign. The engagement began at 0100 hours when the destroyer USS Cushing spotted the Japanese formation approaching from the northwest. Within minutes, the two forces were hopelessly intermingled in the darkness, with friend and foe firing at muzzle flashes and radar contacts at ranges measured in hundreds of yards rather than miles. The carefully planned formations of both sides dissolved into a melee that sailors would later describe as the barroom brawl of naval warfare. Captain Casson Young of the USS San Francisco found himself engaging the battleship High at a range of less than 3,000 yards, his 8-inch guns firing directly into the Japanese giant's superstructure. The battleship's 14-inch shells were too large to be effective at such close range, passing through the cruiser's thin armor without exploding. But her secondary batteries were devastating to the American ship's exposed personnel. The USS Atlanta, Admiral Norman Scott's flagship, became the focal point of the battle's most intense fighting. Caught between the Japanese battleships and her own friendly fire, the light cruiser was torn apart by shells from both sides. Admiral Scott was killed instantly when a Japanese shell struck his bridge, while the ship's captain, Samuel Jenkins, was mortally wounded but continued directing the fight until the Atlanta finally went dead in the water. The destroyer USS Laffey, under Lieutenant Commander William Hank, epitomized the desperate courage of the American force. Finding herself alongside the battleship High, the destroyer's crew fired every weapon they possessed directly into the Japanese ship's hull. When the Laffey's guns were destroyed, her crew threw shell casings and anything else they could find at the enemy. The destroyer was eventually sunk, but not before inflicting serious damage on the battleship. Military historians at the Naval War College later determined that the battle's outcome was decided by the willingness of individual American ship commanders to close with the enemy regardless of the odds. The Japanese, despite their superior firepower, were unprepared for the intensity of the American attack and the confusion that resulted from close-range night fighting. The battle reached its climax when the USS Washington, the most powerful American battleship in the Pacific, arrived as part of Admiral Willis Lee's Task Force 64 in a running gun battle that lasted less than 7 minutes. The Washington's 16-inch guns reduced the Japanese battleship Kirishima to a burning wreck. The engagement demonstrated that American naval forces had finally learned to fight effectively at night. The cost of victory was enormous. The American force lost 2 light cruisers and 4 destroyers, with over 400 sailors killed or wounded. But the Japanese had lost a battleship, 2 destroyers, and most critically, the psychological advantage they had maintained since the beginning of the war. The Imperial Navy's aura of invincibility was shattered in the waters off Guadalcanal. More importantly, the Japanese bombardment force had been driven off before it could complete its mission. Henderson Field remained operational, and the massive troop convoy that was supposed to land under cover of the bombardment was forced to turn back. The naval battle of Guadalcanal had saved the marine perimeter and marked the beginning of Japan's long retreat across the Pacific. The waters around Guadalcanal had claimed so many ships from both sides that they became known as Iron Batom Sound, a graveyard of twisted metal and broken dreams that testified to the savage intensity of the fighting. The naval war had reached its decisive moment, and America had emerged victorious. The roar of Wright Cyclone engines echoed across Henderson Field as Major Joseph Jacob Foss led his division of Grumman Wildcats into the morning sky. On November 7, 1942, below them, the crude coral runway showed the scars of months of Japanese bombing. But the airfield remained operational through the determination of Marines, who had turned a construction site into the most important piece of real estate in the Pacific. The pilots of Marine Air Group 233 had given themselves the call sign Cactus, taken from the codename for Guadalcanal itself. What had begun as a handful of fighters and dive bombers had evolved into a multi-service operation that included Marine, Navy, and Army Air Force squadrons, all united by the common goal of keeping Henderson Field operational and the Japanese at bay. The odds against the Cactus Air Force were staggering. Japanese air attacks came daily, often involving formations of 50 or more bombers escorted by the deadly Mitsubishi Zero fighters. The Americans were flying from a damaged runway with limited fuel and ammunition against pilots who had been honed by months of combat over China and the Dutch East Indies. Yet somehow, the American pilots not only survived, but began to turn the tide of the air war. Captain Marion Carl of Fighter Squadron 223 had perfected the tactics that would become standard throughout the Pacific War. The Wildcat could not turn with the Zero. but it could dive faster and had superior armor protection. American pilots learned to attack from above, make a single firing pass, and then dive away before the Japanese could respond. These boom and zoom tactics negated the Zero's maneuverability advantage and played to the Wildcat's strengths. The most famous pilot of the Cactus Air Force was Major Foss himself, who would eventually become the first American ace to equal Eddie Rickenbacker's World War I record of 26 aerial victories. Foss's hunting technique was methodical and deadly. He would position his division above incoming Japanese formations, wait for the perfect moment, then lead a coordinated attack that scattered the enemy bombers and left their escorts vulnerable to follow-up attacks. The dive bomber pilots of Scout Bombing Squadron 232 faced an even more dangerous mission, flying the obsolescent Douglas Dauntless. They were tasked with attacking Japanese ships during the daylight hours, when the Tokyo Express was most vulnerable. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Mangrum led these missions with clockwork precision, his pilots diving through intense anti-aircraft fire to deliver their 1,000-pound bombs with devastating accuracy. The Japanese response to the Cactus Air Force was to increase the intensity of their attacks. The raid of October 14, 1942, involved over 100 Japanese aircraft in a coordinated attempt to destroy Henderson Field permanently. The attack was met by every available American fighter, and the resulting battle became known as the Marianas Turkey Shoot for the number of Japanese planes shot down. According to declassified intelligence reports, the Japanese High Command was stunned by the effectiveness of the American air defenses. Experienced pilots, who had dominated the skies over the Philippines and Dutch East Indies, were being shot down by Marines who had learned to fly in the relative safety of American training fields. The technological and tactical innovations that had given Japan early dominance were being countered by American adaptability and determination. The maintenance crews of the Cactus Air Force deserves equal credit for keeping the aircraft operational under impossible conditions, working around the clock in tropical heat, with limited spare parts and constant threat of enemy attack. These Marines kept more aircraft flying than should have been possible. They cannibalized wrecked planes, improvised repairs with salvaged materials, and somehow managed to maintain an operational rate that amazed even veteran pilots. The most critical moment for the Cactus Air Force came during the naval battles of November, when Japanese battleships threatened to destroy Henderson Field with their massive guns. American dive bombers, flying in conditions that would have grounded civilian aircraft, managed to damage several Japanese capital ships and disrupt their bombardment schedules. The coordination between air and naval forces that would characterize later Pacific campaigns was first perfected over Guadalcanal. By December, the character of the air war had fundamentally changed. Japanese formations that had once approached Guadalcanal with confidence now faced a gauntlet of American fighters that inflicted unsustainable losses. The Cactus Air Force had gained air superiority over the Solomons, and Japanese pilots were increasingly reluctant to engage in daylight operations. The young pilots who had flown from Henderson Field's crude runway had accomplished something that military experts had thought impossible. They had defeated the Japanese Air Force in sustained combat and established American dominance in the skies over the Pacific. The morning of January 14, 1943, brought a strange quiet to the jungles of Guadalcanal as Major General Alexander Patch prepared his 14th Corps for what would be the final offensive of the campaign. Intelligence reports suggested the Japanese were planning a withdrawal, but 6 months of brutal fighting had taught the Americans never to underestimate their enemy's capacity for resistance. The Japanese decision to evacuate Guadalcanal had been made at the highest levels of government in Tokyo. Emperor Hirohito himself had authorized Operation K, the complex plan to extract the remaining Japanese forces under cover of darkness, while maintaining the fiction that the Imperial Army was conducting a strategic advance to new positions. The truth was far more sobering. Japan was conducting its first major retreat of the Pacific War. Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, commander of the Japanese 17th Army, faced an impossible situation. His forces had been reduced to Fewer than 12,000 effective soldiers, many of them suffering from malaria, dysentery, and malnutrition. The Tokyo Express could no longer deliver adequate supplies, and American air power made daylight movement suicide. The choice was evacuation or annihilation. The American advance began with a coordinated assault by the 25th Infantry Division and the 2nd Marine Division, supported by massive artillery barrages and close air support from Henderson Field. The Japanese defensive positions, constructed over months of fighting, were formidable obstacles that required individual reduction by small unit actions. Every bunker, every foxhole, every fallen tree became a potential strong point. Colonel William Jenna of the 161st Infantry Regiment led the attack on the Japanese positions around Kokumbona, the enemy's main supply base on the western coast. The fighting was savage and personal, with Japanese soldiers choosing death over surrender in accordance with their military code. American casualties mounted as they discovered that even a retreating Japanese army was a dangerous opponent. The most significant breakthrough came when elements of the 1st Battalion, 27th Infantry Regiment, reached the coast near Cape Esperance, effectively cutting the Japanese line of retreat. For a brief moment, it appeared that the entire Japanese garrison might be trapped and forced into a final, desperate battle. The psychological impact on both sides was enormous. The Americans sensed complete victory, while the Japanese faced the possibility of annihilation. However, the Japanese had prepared for this contingency. Fast destroyers and cruisers, operating under cover of darkness, began the evacuation of key personnel and equipment. The operation was a masterpiece of military planning, with Japanese naval forces running precise schedules that maximized the number of soldiers evacuated while minimizing exposure to American air attack. Contemporary accounts from the Associated Press described the final phase of the campaign as a race against time, in which American forces attempted to overrun Japanese positions before the evacuation could be completed. The Marines and soldiers advancing through the jungle could hear the sound of Japanese ships offshore, loading the defenders they had fought for so long. The discovery of abandoned Japanese positions on February 1st revealed the true scope of the evacuation. Well-constructed bunkers and artillery positions had been systematically destroyed, while personal equipment and supplies had been left behind in organized piles. The Japanese had conducted a withdrawal that military historians would later study as a model of tactical excellence under impossible conditions. The Americans found evidence of the Japanese ordeal in the abandoned camps, makeshift hospitals filled with crude medical supplies, rice stores that had been carefully rationed, and personal letters that revealed the psychological strain of the campaign. The Japanese soldiers who had fought so tenaciously were revealed to be human beings who had endured the same hardships as their American opponents. The final count was sobering for both sides. American casualties for the entire campaign exceeded 7,000 killed and wounded, while Japanese losses were estimated at over 24,000. The strategic implications were even more significant. Japan had lost its first major ground campaign and was now committed to a defensive war that would consume resources faster than they could be replaced. The Battle of Guadalcanal had ended, not with a climactic final assault, but with the recognition that one side could no longer continue the fight. The Japanese withdrawal marked the beginning of their long retreat across the Pacific, a retreat that would end only with the surrender ceremony on the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. The silence that descended over Henderson Field on February 9, 1943, was unlike anything the Marines had experienced during 6 months of continuous combat. For the first time since August, no Japanese artillery shells fell on the airfield, no enemy aircraft appeared in the sky, and no Tokyo Express destroyers disrupted the night with their bombardments. The Battle of Guadalcanal was over, and America had won its first major victory against the Japanese Empire.